Catus Maximus here. So I'm doing my second video about tips, tuning, and upgrades to the Vevor, and they're all made by the same company. These 1x30-inch belt grinders hit the market about 3 or 4 years ago. Vevor's really been pushing into them. They do a big purchase and have been selling them pretty cheap, but there is definitely quality control issues as well as assembly issues. So I did a video reviewing one of these, and gotta be honest here, Vevor has sent me these as promotional products for free. Notice I use the word plural, products, because if I've actually received 3 of these from Vevor. The first one that I got, that I did that first, or was going to do the first review, there was some kind of poor machining, or it was bent during shipping. These are not shipped very well. They're actually pretty heavy. The amount of steel that's on them, they probably weigh 15-20 pounds, and they just have a layer. They're actually tilted upwards, so the pulley is actually facing towards the top of the box. An inch of styrofoam. They're not using closed cell foam, and the styrofoam gets broken apart, and it got hit, caused the wheel to be bent. And these wheels actually have to run pretty true, otherwise the belt will start a resonance, usually around 2000 RPM, and it's just totally useless. The second issue that I've had is grit in the bearings. The bearings were so cheap that they just weren't properly cleaned at the factory before they were assembled, and you would run them and you would hear and feel. Here's an example of the wheels from one of the other ones. I don't know if you can hear that. That noise that it's making is grit in brand new rubber sealed bearings, which is pretty unacceptable. That doesn't count with the motor, because the motor is made by some type of higher quality servo motor manufacturer. And the reason I like the Vevors is the other ones on the market have like a vertical kind of controller box, which seems like it's meant to be mounted under a ledge or under a table, and it has a dial on the side with the display on the front. Kind of a weird format, so I really like that they had this different version of a control box. So Vevor, and what they do is they have like their hands and their feet, and their hands are the Vevor corporate website, and the managers promote products to them. And then there's the Amazon and other alternative non-corporate website sales, and they have different reps. And so the Amazon Vevor rep said, "Hey, we have this belt grinder, offering me one of these." I thought I just got one or two, which it took to get one good one. And literally, the very next day, I went to go use this one and turn on the control box, moved a little bit, and it just clicked. It just clicked, and just the display disappeared and it stopped working. And I'll get into that, but there's a metal lock ring for this button. It wasn't secured, and it had come into contact with something on the circuit board and just killed it instantly. So I wrote the Amazon rep back and said, "Yeah, send me another one." So I've ended up with 3 of these promotionally from Vevor due to just the crazy issues. Both the first ones had gritty bearings, but the second one had a straight motor, so I put it on the frame of the first one. The second one, unfortunately, had good bearings, but the wheel, and I can show you here if I zoom in. There we go. You might just be able to see this if I hold it just right and spin this wheel. I'm not shaking it back and forth. This wheel has actually been, when it was molded, it's off center by more than 1/8 of an inch. And on this 4-inch wheel, it's untenable. As soon as it gets up to around 2000 RPM, it causes the belt to expand and contract, causing a resonance where the belt and everything just starts shaking violently and flies off the machine. So that's why I took the third one. I said, "Oh my God, I've had a controller issue. I've had pulley issues there. They had gritty bearings." And so the third one actually had good bearings that didn't make funky sounds. I thought, okay, so what Vevor's got to do, and what I was noticing is that they've right now I will have the Amazon link because they were dropped in price down to like $190 or something. But I think they're having some return issues. It's possibly they sold out, but there is just and that's stuff that will really disappoint people. There's also some curiosities, and that's what I'll talk about in what I've done. I mean, and the crazy thing is I've ended up with 3 of these and have about 1.5 working ones. The other one I'm just going to sell to a friend for like $60 because the third one I got also had a wobbling motor. So there's some machining inconsistencies with the drive wheels on these, molding inconsistency with these wheels, grit in the bearings, which is all pretty serious stuff. I mean, they should either do better quality control. Maybe that's the difference between the versions of these that are $300, so that you just better factory quality control rather than just take all the random parts and throw them together. All 3 of them had a lot of loose fasteners. Particularly, there is this aluminum block right here, which is like a primary block which links the tilt plate to the main body of the tool. There's a lot of load on that. Steel fasteners and a lot of stress. And they just weren't tight enough, and a lot of the fasteners were. So you have to go through the whole thing and make sure all the fasteners are tight. And I thought either Vevor just needs to, bite the bullet and charge more and ask for better quality control from the factory and better equipment testing, making sure there isn't excessive vibration, that there isn't weird belt tracking issues. What I've had to do here, one of the modifications, is I added washers to offset the tracking pulley out about 1/8 of an inch. I chose to do it at the bracket so that the pivot point stays the same. If I had done a washer just behind the tracking wheel itself, then it would have swung up and down more with each fraction of a screw turn, and I didn't want to change that ratio. I just wanted to move over so when I run the rubber wheel that the belt is centered between the drive wheel, the tracking wheel, and the driven or working wheel. But when I use this accessory, and since I got enough of them, what you have is you have this little round peg. You remove this fastener, loosen this up, and you're supposed to swap it between arms. But now, since I did have basically an entire parts unit, almost, minus a controller, minus a usable rubber wheel, minus a bunch of gritty bearings, I did have a separate bar, and so charge a little more and include a separate bar. That way it's easy, and platen. That way it's easier just to swap in back and forth like the bigger ones are. Anyway, the weird thing is getting the belt to track straight among these 3 rolls. I've had, when I swapped to this, there's just some kind of difference in the offset between this and this rubber wheel, and I had to put a washer back there to push this out. And oddly enough, when I run this, it runs centered on this and on the tracking wheel, but it's offset a little bit further out. Now, the drive wheel is wider than an inch. It's about 1.25 inches. And that's really why I recommend like Amazon. I think Vevor's website's pretty decent about returns too, but these are the type of things that are great. And for the prices they're selling them out there, they're an awesome deal. As I've said before, the 2/3 horse, 550 watt, fully censored brushless DC motor, and the controller is worth what they're charging, the $200 to $300 realistically, even for Chinese ones, because it is a programmable controller. It's a pretty nice motor. But to hit that price point, they are just really pushing the low quality control, pushing their workers just to pound these things out, assemble them as quick as they can. And it's going to hurt Vevor's reputation. And especially on a tool like this isn't like, so many of the other manufactured tools like drill presses and magnetic drills and other stuff, which has been just fine from Vevor. This is like most of the components on this, if not all of them, could be manufactured at home on a simple desktop, benchtop mill and little mini lathe, except for the overmolded rubber wheel. So besides that, all the fasteners are low grade, except for there are some expensive ones. And there, besides a custom machine pin for this wheel, the only high grade 12.9s are these are custom made fasteners with extra wide flanges, and they have ground shanks on them for the pivot bearing back here, for the tracking wheel, and for both of these wheels here. Those are like the expensive fasteners that they had to get for those. And speaking of bearings, since they are gritty, if people want to know, the motors and use better quality bearings, and those are all pre-assembled at the motor factory. Those are good, but the rest of these, I think they're just tapping them in with a hammer during assembly, and that may be causing some of the damage to them. But we have, and they're all double bearings, so they actually hold straight, but this is a 6002, and then the rest are 6200s, except for a very oddball 6900 for the pivot bearing. And I will mention that a pivot bearing is also not rubber sealed. And they probably, I mean, it does use a ball bearing, because this pivot does, you know, when the seam of the belt goes across, it does need to move a little bit. And so wisely they realize that having just a piece of aluminum or steel on even a ground shaft, this thing's going to be wiggling with so many cycles that it will quickly wear away. So wisely they put in a ball bearing, which allows it to move freely, and is a wear component that's easily replaced to restore full service if it has any issues. So, I mean, there's, you know, some nice aspects. Other things that I changed out, the tension knob had a pretty weak spring, and would kind of, you know, if you had certain speeds, you would still get a little bit of vibration. It won't be violent, throwing off the belt vibration like with a improperly molded 4-inch wheel. But nonetheless, the tracking would creep a little bit, so I put in a much stronger spring, a way stronger spring. And that helps keep the tracking knob going. So the other big thing that I was going to point out is these are 6mm or slightly under, we'll call it 1/4-inch plates. But all the screws they've got set up so they don't penetrate through the plates, like there, through here. Well, you can see, I mean, look at the thickness of this. Come on, camera. Look at the thickness of this plate. And that screw is only going in that far. I mean, it's literally like 3 or 4 threads, 3 or 4 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch, maybe a touch more than 1/8 of an inch, 3/16 of an inch of thread engagement in these plates. And so even when you do tighten the screws down, they're going to want to loosen up on you. Temperature changes, knocking it around, you know, moving it between, you know, a shelf and your workbench, and you're constantly going to be having to deal with them. And I recognize that pretty early. I mean, I'm familiar with what happens when you have screws that are only held in by, you know, 3 or 4 threads, turns of the threads. So I collect a lot of fasteners, and so what I did is I went through and, you know, some of them I only had washer head bolts, but replaced those with this nice washers heads so that they don't want to self-loosen and they make full engagement. Here where there's that aluminum block, I actually ran longer fasteners and put nuts on the other side right where it's this critical piece so that they really can't get loose. And the same thing here, longer bolts with jam nuts, longer bolts holding on this bracket. Of course, I had to use washers to offset this. Longer bolts to hold in the bearing, because the screws that were going through this plate only went in just a tiny amount in this aluminum block, and I knew that was going to give me some trouble at some point. You know, put washers under the heads of the bolts. Just a lot of longer bolts through here. I can show you. Oddly enough, maybe it's a consideration for grip, but this back hole is actually only threaded part of the way through this beam, and then it's oversized so the rest of the way. I guess if it was just a straight threaded through hole, that they were worried about grit and it getting stripped out. But since I had the extra beam, I wanted this held on really securely, so I put in a long bolt and a couple extra nuts to jam that together. Longer bolts to go through here, since they do tap these pretty deep. Other things like through use where it's hard to tighten them or they will get loose as you can see with the these slots, when you tighten down this fastener, it's just being holding on just by the two little sides, two little lips of those socket head cap screws. And that just didn't satisfy me at all. So that's a lot of my upgrades, is like down here where it says sliding portion. I put in a big fender washer, so there's just, and a washer head bolt on top of that, just to make lots more surface area here. I double washered it. The reason I would double washer it is because if you put a lot of pressure with a small bolt head, even on a big fender washer, it'll kind of cause the fender washer to want to make a cup shape and not grip the way you want it to. So it's kind of making a stack and progressively spreading out the load. So that's what I did along all these components here, so that they would stay tight. Longer bolts to the base, and they actually stick all the way through here, full thread engagement. And then I had these little micro bolts, and so I put those on as little feeties so it wasn't sitting right there. So that's, and I actually had recorded and was going to make one of those fancy videos where you speed it up and you show people, you know, they replace all the components and stuff, but I tried doing that and I screwed it up so bad that I just gave up on that aspect of it. And then there are a couple of operational tips. That's the easiest way to describe it. I mean, what I've also done here is just to do adjustments. Now all I need is one Allen wrench and this little ratcheting 10 millimeter. And you still want to do that if you want to adjust the bevel angle here. If I want to run it sideways, then I'll need to have to swap it out to these horizontal plates. Oh, there's yet something else. These pulleys, they're obviously using more equipment than just these, because there's actually a V-belt groove on the back of the pulley. And there's a counter bore, and these are actually key driven. It's a pretty decent connection to the motor. But the counter bore goes so deep that it interferes with the lip that's on the end of the motor. The end of the motor is just like this. It has a smooth shank with a slot cut in it for a keyway, and then a smaller section where the threads are. And that counter bore was going below this larger diameter section, meaning you couldn't just throw on the pulley a single washer and then twist down the nut, because the nut, there's enough threads to actually hold it on. So they had this weird little plastic thing that's under the nut that has this little space here, this little chamfer come on camera, so that it'll clear. This will go around the shank of the full diameter, the keyed portion of the shaft, and then the nut can sit on top of this, and it takes up enough space so where you can torque it down. I didn't know what was going on with that. I collect washers and stuff, and I actually found just the right washers that will sit in there and go around the large diameter of the motor and take up the space, so the nut will actually go tight and it'll be a nice secure connection without having a plastic piece in there. I mean, everywhere I had to work on fasteners, like same thing here. I only had gold ones, but wider surface area, slightly longer fasteners that went all the way through this connection plate here, that go, come on, they go all the way through this plate here rather than halfway through. I mean, the only place you really have to use short fasteners is like here, where you can't have them stick out, and like on the platen here, where you can't have them stick out.
I'm not quite sure how to help you with that.
But these things, you know, for their price, if you're willing to spend some time just fiddling around with it, replacing some fasteners, having availability to really check it out as soon as it arrives, so you can send it back if you have some horrible out of round or out of balance issue, they can be good, but they need, you know, some tinkering. And to tell you the truth, yeah, I got these for free as promotional products, and it was still a hassle. I still had to put a bunch of time into testing them out, having the problems, and then, you know, it's one thing like after another, and it's just like, you got to do a little bit better, Vevor, even if you can't sell it for it's cheap. And by the way, here's that controller that had failed on me, and the issue on this one, and I checked the fuse. If it does all randomly fail, it's worth going in here because there is an easily replaceable fuse. But this metal ring that holds the metal start-stop button was just dangling along the wires, and so when you put it in, the wires fold up and it touched something right around, I assume in this area because that's where it was dangling, and just took this out. There's like no burn marks, but it doesn't matter. You know, this thing, if you have a random piece of metal like that lock ring touching random contacts on a 120 volt driver board, you can certainly expect some sparks and stuff. And so it just killed it, which is unfortunate because it's actually a pretty nice driver board. It looks pretty nice. I was talking about it has the ability to hook up an LED. I don't know if that's through this connector or through this connector because they don't have silk screening. It is pretty modern, 2023-09, and a cool red PCB. We can see 6 power transistors. So what they're doing is they're probably running them, and since it's a 3-phase censored brushless DC motor, it varies duty cycle. It doesn't go from positive to negative. So these wouldn't be push-pull. They're just probably running them in parallel. Like these activate, then these activate, and then these activate. So it offsets the thermal load to just a bit of a wider area. So, you know, that's kind of the thing. It's kind of being the honest reviewer. Vevor hates me for making this video and getting 3 grinders from them to put together one good one. Then I'm going to tell my subscribers about it because my subscribers is what makes my channel, not Vevor. Not people who send me free stuff. I love it because I just don't have very much money, and so obviously it's pretty cool when that happens. But I always have to share my true, honest opinion, and people often say I'm pretty critical on my channel, but I kind of take it seriously. Kind of take what I tell you viewers, people who are watching. I actually want to try to provide accurate, honest, well thought out, as balanced, not to be, overly critical, which I'm often criticized for, but just to have, better expectations and oh yeah, the little metal thing fell off this knob too. But I try to actually set proper expectations so that when somebody watches one of my reviews, they'll have a similar experience. They won't be surprised. There won't be anything that they didn't know already after watching my video, and that's kind of the purpose of it and why I am critical. I mean, there's plenty of things I'm really very positive about and glowing about just because I'm excited about them. But I have to keep it real and keep it grounded. And when it comes to like mechanical systems like this, I'm going to be a little bit more apprehensive and more retentive, more discerning about it because the nature of this machine, it should have some basic stuff, such as the wheels and belts lining up, fasteners being tight and being proper enough to where it won't get loose every 2 hours you use it and having to retighten them, and not having wobbling wheels and gritty bearings so it makes a bunch of excess noise as soon as you get it, and then 10 or 20 hours later you got to replace the bearings because they're screeching. So I was not the best about understanding tracking. I've learned a few things about tracking on these, one of which is the fact that when you're using the rubber wheel, you want to have this way down here. Not all the way down. You want to have some clearance like this, but you really want to have quite a bit of tension. Run it by hand and then start off slow. Start it up. And what I found is once you kind of find the right spot here, it actually will hold its tracking pretty decently, and then once you kind of find the center line, you get to the speed that you want to use. Readjust the tracking, and it actually holds it pretty decently. This is key, is you can't have a little bit of tension. You gotta pull this down so there's a lot more tension, so it's pressing that curvature into the belt. Once you kind of do that, it's really pretty good. If you really send it up to high speeds, you do have to still continue to adjust it. But it's not really that bad. I only had to do a little bit between maximum speed and say down here at 1,000 RPM. It shifts around maybe 1/8 of an inch, and all I have to do is kind of get it to cooperate a little bit. And once you get the belt close, it's just sometimes you turn this knob, you can't even see how much you've turned it. You just, like 1 degree, you just change the amount of tension by just a hair, and that will get the belt to kind of glide over and stay in the right spot. So anyway, as we can see in this situation, the belt's actually centered on the drive wheel, pretty well centered on the tracking wheel, and of course, you can really get it. I mean, it's perfect on the rubber wheel. You can see that's with the washers that have offset this. So, and that's why I think Vevor should actually just charge $300 for these and just have proper testing at the factory to make sure everything's running true and concentric, which will add a $20 to $50 to it, and include a separate bar. So if I want to switch from the wheel, I don't have to unscrew this, pull this thing out, put it in. What's kind of nice about having these things, kind of ready to go is, like in this case, I've taken a square, so this table is exactly 90 degrees to this face. And it's just a lot easier just to swap that out. Make sure I get this on there correctly. And so what I'm showing here, one is you need a lot more, especially when this is vertical. If you tilt this back, then this peak moves downward and you have more space. But on the vertical position is where you have the maximum diameter for the belt to retract. So you only have so much space here. Whoop. Like so. A little bit of flex, but still pretty darn tight. And so what we'll see here, now this is a resonance that's really due to the seam in the belt. It doesn't get too crazy, and it's only at a certain RPM, but what we'll find here is if I get this nice and centered up, I probably should have more tension. Part of this vibration is still a little bit of wobble in the drive wheel. None of the three this was the best out of the three. But none of them had like perfectly concentric drive wheels. They really need to get to the bottom of that. Anyway, this is obviously a long kind of blabbing video about this thing, but I feel necessary so that people really know kind of what's going on. The prices that Vevor is selling these at, and I assume some of the other companies that. So this wobble here is actually a result of just a slight amount of lack of concentricity on the drive wheel in this case. And Vevor just is trying to hit such a low price point that the quality has gone, the quality's gone down in areas where you gotta have, and it's gotta be checked, that the drive wheels are really concentric, or really running round. If you get a decent one like this, it will still be more than serviceable and will be great for what it is. And track well, and you know, the vibration goes away after that one particular resonant frequency, and you know, does overall pretty good, especially for the performance you're getting out of the controller and the motor. But we can see here, and I don't know why there's a difference between the rubber wheel, but we're centered on this. We're pretty well centered on the tracking wheel, but we can see the belt is closer to, it's actually not hanging off the edge of the drive wheel. It's just right on the edge. And whoop, because of the lack of concentricity, it's actually like the drive wheel is slightly tilted. There's a lack of parallelism between the outside diameter and the hole that they drilled. So when the belt's closer to this outer edge, I'm experiencing a little bit more run out than when it's moved in a little bit when I'm using the rubber wheel. But nonetheless, I thought that was kind of an interesting thing that should have been caught when they were designing this, is the fact that there's a centering or offset issue, or a measurement issue between this platen and the 4-inch wheel. So this video is already half an hour long. I don't even know how it ended up being that long. But there's a lot of YouTube videos, and actually a lot of them I see these problems with theirs, whether or not they're, you know, they're talking about the Vevors or whatever brand that they have, earlier ones. And they're just dealing with them or assuming that's just the way these kind of machines work, when really they don't. There are some professional 1x30s, but they're expensive. The ones I found were anywhere from $600 to $1,000 for this size. And that's what they're charging for 2x72s. And so that's kind of the thing. You're getting this for so cheap that you're just going to have to deal with potentially returning it until you can get one that's serviceable. And the fact that you're going to have to invest some time fiddling with it and a few bucks in fasteners to make it a lot more secure and sturdy. And so, you know, what you're doing is, versus money that you're expending, you're offsetting that with some of your own time and being able to, you know, buy it for cheap, and maybe next paycheck spend some money on fasteners, and the paycheck after that buy some belts, and spread out some of the costs over time, and you'll be rewarded with a pretty awesome tool that really goes right along with the 6 or 8 inch bench grinder. Between this and the bench grinder, you can pretty much do all the sanding, grinding, polishing, wire wheeling you need. But these things are just great, particularly for this low speed, delicate stuff at 200 RPM. Something no bench grinder is going to be able to do is be able to go so slow. I mean, you can see it'll push itself back across the table, providing constant power even at this very slow speed. It just provides a huge advantage, especially for anybody who does any kind of woodworking or fabrication with smaller stuff. It just allows you to have a high degree of precision. It's just a shame that for the money that you save, there's a degree of hassle that goes along with it. And that's what's kind of hard to convince companies like Vevor is, you know, in this case, tell your supplier, you know, we don't need to pay $120 or $100 per unit. We'll pay $150 per unit, charge the customers $300, and just have better quality control. And then you'll have a lot better satisfaction. People will say, oh, it's $300, but at least everything ran true and worked well and tracked, you know, properly and didn't vibrate. People will just be a lot happier that way. Even if they have to spend a little bit of extra money, at least they're saving themselves some hassle. I mean, the way these things are packed and shipped, they need some help. Like on this one, this wire ended up under some kind of sharp components and nearly destroyed the motor wire during shipping, because it's just wrapped in bubble. It's assembled, wrapped in bubble wrap. and then just tossed in a cardboard box, kind of stuffed in there, and everything just gets kind of kicked around and beat up, and I'm sure that's causing them some issues too. Anyway, thanks for watching this really long video. Really wanted to make something like this about this tool because I've been thinking about it a lot. And I really like mechanical tools. I've always kind of wanted one of these things, and it's just been like this. I mean, I would have given up on it if I was buying this. I would have returned the second one, and by the time I got the third one and noticed that it had some of the same issues, I just would have given up and accepted not having one of these tools. The only way I do is simply because they're willing to send me multiple units so that I could assemble one that was actually satisfying, something that I know I can pull off the shelf and actually use and will run how I expect it to run and not have any kind of, funky issues. Excessive resonance and vibration and controllers firing themselves because they were assembled so hastily. And that's something I really worry about. I wonder how many of those they've forgotten to tighten that ring, and how many controllers have just popped, just disappeared. Works 1 second, and then you go move it around to a different portion of the table, or just adjust the position of the controller, and that just happens to knock that piece of metal onto the motherboard, and boom, it's just gone. They really got to get that under control. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time.